sure you get a spot on there, which is on the 4th of October. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Nikos, who's going to introduce all the speakers for our final panel.
Thank you very much. So this is the final panel on psychology. So we have Joss Dickson. Joss is a positive psychologist and a trauma therapist. He's also the clinical director of Resurface, which, if I understand it well, it's a retreat where you put these psychological principles into action. With surfing, okay. So check this out. We have Greg Scorcho, who is the director of Culture on the Offensive. I've already said positive things about Greg in the previous panel, so if this bromance goes on, we're going to be tiring, so I'll just move to the next speaker. We've got Charlotte Gill. She's a freelance journalist. She writes quite often in The Telegraph. One of her latest articles was about how political tribalism impacts dating. I found this very interesting, so you can check it in the Telegraph. So which is the order of speaking? I should know that, but I don't. Shall we go 1, 2, 3? Good.
Is that working? Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So, I had a sort of idea of what I was going to talk about, and then it's been completely knocked out by, I just actually saw a client. I had to step out today and see a client for a couple of hours and come back here. And right at the end they said, what are you up to now? And I said, I'm actually going to go and talk about Jordan Peterson. And this person went, oh my God, he's an F. But his psychology is pretty good. And I said, what's your, I was like, oh, I've got to go, but what's your issue? And he said, well, he's not alt-right, but he kind of courts the alt-right, and he doesn't clarify his terms. And this is something I've heard a lot today spoken about. He uses wishy-washy language. He's kind of all over the place, but he really knows his stuff. And I think that's my experience of Jordan Peterson within psychology. I would never want to challenge him on anything to do with clinical psychology in terms of research and in terms of the depth of knowledge and his ability to cite research, etc. I'm always very impressed when I see that. His knowledge of antidepressants all the way across to his knowledge of how AA works, because I work a lot in addiction treatment, and I've listened to him speak about that, and I'm like, yeah, he's pretty bang on the money there. And what I'm just going to say, because I say this before, I really find the Q&A the most valuable part of these kind of sessions, but what I want to put across to you is how I see Jordan Peterson in terms of psychology is actually his least controversial area. When I look and listen to him, he's a clinical psychologist. He's trained in the traditional manners. He does a lot of psychodynamic work, a lot of cognitive therapy, humanistic work. The way he talks about psychology is very mainstream. And what I'm surprised at, though, is that he's both a cognitive psychologist. A lot of the interventions he puts out there are very CBT-based and very effective, standard ones that you would expect. And then you've got his whole passion for Jung on the other side. So you've got this, and this is very much how I see Jordan Peterson. He's like a mixed economy of psychology and philosophy. He's got the analytic, very deterministic area of psychology going on. The behaviorists and the analysts are very, very deterministic. And then you've got his very strong cognitive side, and he really reflects how I see mainstream psychology in general. Mainstream psychology nowadays is very good at targeted acute interventions for significant problems you've got going on, and then is very confused about greater meaning, say what is these questions you have, and what is the meaning of life, etc. But how to live like a long-term life. There aren't that many. I don't see that many answers in mainstream psychology, and he dismisses a lot of the positive psychology movement. He dismisses being happy. He dismisses a lot of the self-esteem movement. Now I understand him dismissing the kind of 90s pop psychology self-esteem movement, but the more kind of Brandon-esque self-esteem movement that expanded there, I'm surprised he rejects and then accepts at the same time Angela Duckworth's work on grit and achievement. If you look up, there's a very clip of him talking about why you shouldn't disturb young boys who are learning to skateboard. And he said they're learning mastery, they're generating achievement. So I find that Jordan Peterson, in my limited knowledge, I don't study him like specifically, I come across his work a lot, is there's some excellent interventions and things that he puts across, but like psychology in general, it can be very muddled. And I'll finish on this. What I noticed when the book came out, 12 Rules of Life, is I did notice that I'm working probably on average with about 20, 25 people a week in my clinical practice. I would say when that book came out, about 5 or 6 people came in and said, I've got this book. So the phenomenon, it spread out. He was regarded amongst those people who were interested in self-help and changing themselves. And I noticed that hardly anyone read it all the way through. They bought it and they liked bits of it. And I think that's Jordan Peterson in general that I notice a lot in psychology, is people like bits of it and they take what they like and they leave the rest. And that's been my experience so far, and I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
All right, so you can hear me now? One of the criticisms of Jordan Peterson that I hear over and over and over again is he's playing a trick on people. So what he's doing is he is giving people commonsensical clinical psychology advice about how to do things like quit smoking and lose weight that any clinical psychologist could give, maybe with a bit more rhetorical flourishing than your average clinical psychologist, but fundamentally he's doing something any psychologist could do, but people are so appreciative of the help that they have and they feel so emotionally moved that they then start listening to his politics, which have no relevance to the clinical psychology, and he's not an expert in politics simply because he's helped people. This is one of the main attacks on Peterson, as a kind of charlatan. And what I want to say is that I think Peterson's clinical psychology is actually political. It has political implications that he constantly makes references to whenever he's doing speeches about mental health, and even often when he's giving practical advice about how to cure things like anxiety or how to deal with depression or the death of a loved one or things like that. So there are elements of his psychology that are political in ways that I don't like. Like, I think he's far too socially conservative for my taste. And I also think that he is too unreflectively supportive of only masculine virtues, rather than a more balanced approach which can appreciate the masculine and the feminine, or at least the stereotypically masculine and the feminine, stereotypically feminine as well. But there is something he does politically with his psychology, which I find so inspirational and so important and so exciting and new that I'm a huge fan of Jordan Peterson, even though there are lots of things about him I disagree with and lots of things he says I disagree with. So what is this thing he's doing that I find so innovative and important at this particular moment in time? What Jordan Peterson is doing is he's articulating that it's important for people to develop virtues of character and habits of mind that sustain our liberal democratic tradition. So it's not enough to defend abstract liberal principles like freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, due process, democracy, individual sovereignty, and so on. One also has to have an affection, an affinity for these things that comes from having certain habits of mind, certain character virtues, virtues that at the moment our mainstream culture, as well as the left, seem to me to be totally and absolutely denigrating. So what are these important virtues that Peterson is articulating and promoting in people with such an incredible amount of passion and inspirational pizzazz? Well, the first one, and the most important one, I think, is the primacy of personal agency over political agency. And this is what he's getting at when he's talking about clean your room. So what is personal agency? Personal agency is the ability to overcome obstacles and problems in life using your individual self, right? And some of the problems might be political, like somebody, Nikos, for instance, might say something racist to me, right? So that's a problem that is something I have to solve with my personal agency, not just if, say, Nikos was really rude to me, right? Political agency is about saying, okay, I'm going to solve this particular political problem by banding together with others or speaking on behalf of others and making demands, right? So if I use my personal agency, if Nico said something to the effect of, your last talk was great for a Mexican, I might convince him that actually Mexicans aren't any less intelligent than anyone else. But if I were going to use my political agency, I would get him to say it again, record it on my phone, put it on Twitter under a hashtag no racism at Ayn Rand conferences, right? So what I think Peterson is encouraging us to do is go, the personal agency is what you do first. The first thing you do when you encounter a racist remark or something which feels oppressive is try and solve it on the individual level. Try and persuade people to change their mind. Try and broaden their horizons. Do change that way. Only go to the political as a last resort. And the reason I think for Peterson you only go to the political as a last resort is because if you go to the political as a first resort, which is what the culture encourages us to do now, you wind up developing, on the one hand, a deeply unpleasant authoritarian personality where you're constantly looking for slights against you and then constantly threatening people for not complying with you. But you also wind up simultaneously being a very disempowered person who can't do a lot of things because you have no sense of what you're capable of apart from demanding things from others and threatening them. And Peterson has been very eloquent at articulating what's wrong with the kind of person who goes to political agency first rather than last. And I also think he gets mischaracterized here as well, because I don't think he's saying no political activism is permissible, because he himself is a kind of political activist. But what I think he is saying is use your personal agency to change the world first before you, as a last resort, start making demands that are implicit threats on others and going into the political realm. The second virtue that I think Peterson promotes, which is inherently classical liberal, is an appreciation for tolerance. And the way that he does this is by encouraging people to speak the truth as they see it and have that as a cultural norm. Because if you speak the truth as you see it and that becomes part of your cultural norm, you're going to become tolerant and engage in dialogues with people who speak the truth in ways that you don't see it. And then you can then encourage them to change their mind. You can have a discussion, you can have a debate, and that tolerance is incredibly important for a liberal democratic society, because change in such a society must be peaceful rather than violent. And that's one of the huge themes in Peterson's work, not just on politics, but in mental health. Like, tolerance is a precondition for stability in the absence of violence. And stability in the absence of violence is what allows you to develop as an individual psychologically. I think all these things are connected. And then finally, what I think Peterson encourages us to do in terms of our character virtue is have gratitude for hierarchies that are competent. And this is where he gets in hot water with his lobster analogy. Now, I think the way people misinterpret the lobster analogy is to say, what Peterson is saying, that, lobsters are biological like we are. They have hierarchies, therefore the hierarchies are good because we should, use biology as some sort of an ethical norm. And this is, of course, a classic derivation of ought from is, which is illegitimate and suspicious if you interpret his argument in this way, which I think most people who criticize it do. But I think if you actually listen to the lobster argument, it comes in two parts, and it doesn't actually say what most of his critics think it says. So the first part is that we overestimate how easy it is to socialize people out of dominant hierarchies. Because dominant hierarchies are found in nature, they're not merely social constructs. So what he's basically saying is that the dominant hierarchy is a much bigger problem for the leftist than they think it is, because the leftist simply thinks the pathway to getting rid of the dominant hierarchy is socializing everyone out of it by making demands on people and demands on society. And secondly, the second part of the argument is that if you actually look at most dominant hierarchies, what you see is they don't look like things that you associate with negative dominant hierarchies. That is, if you look at most hierarchies in society, they don't look like North Korea. They don't look like the mafia. They look like the fact that most eye surgeons are competent when they do eye surgery. They look like the Beatles. The Beatles is a classic dominance hierarchy because John Lennon and Paul McCartney get 4 tracks per album, and George Harrison only gets 1 or 2, right? So the reason why this is important is because what the culture tells us at this moment in time is that you need to judge things as good or bad based on kind of abstract ethical values, the primary one being equality. What Peterson is saying is, no. Look at things that you've been told are bad and actually ask yourself, does this feel bad? Does this dominance hierarchy that gave us Sgt. Pepper feel like an example of oppression? Don't go by labels. Go by what something is phenomenologically like in terms of feeling benevolent or malevolent. And if you do that, you're going to find that a lot of the hierarchies in the world, even the dominance ones, feel more benevolent than malevolent. And I think that's a very sophisticated argument that gets caricatured as a very simple one. But the reason it's very sophisticated is because it's about getting us to do the opposite of what the zeitgeist at the moment, I think, is pushing us towards, which is in a liberal society where people think that they're being good by exercising only political agency, denigrating personal agency, being intolerant, and wanting to take down hierarchies because of abstract ideas of how they're corrupt, rather than actually looking at how they might be useful or how the replacements of those hierarchies could be things that are even worse.
Hi, I'm Charlotte. Thanks for having me here today. Just to introduce myself again, I'm a journalist and I write mainly about politics, but I also write about psychology. And I guess that's why I'm really into Jordan Peterson and why I liked him to begin with, because when I discovered him last year, I'd been writing a bit about psychology, and most of it was just relaying what I'd learned at university, conveying it very accurately. But I would find that over and over again, whenever I spoke about it, people would say, oh, so you're a right-wing journalist? Or, they would just interpret all the findings that I'd been taught in a very clinical way as right-wing. And I think essentially Jordan Peterson entered an environment where sociological arguments of human development have really been winning. And it's always been made into a bit of a fake war between socialization and biological factors. It's like, which side are you on? Whereas they're actually fairly equal. But the left had really, in my opinion, they'd really monopolised the debate. So, really pushed forward that men and women are exactly the same biologically, and we should expect them to be doing all the same things. And so Jordan Peterson really entered the fore when he went on that Channel 4 interview. And I don't know about the rest of you, but that's really how I discovered him, watching that. And I suppose the main tangible parts of his philosophy around psychology is he talks a lot about gender differences. So Kathy Newman wanted to talk about the pay gap on the show, and he essentially said that part of the reason, and when they were talking about the pay gap and the different factors, and it's really multifaceted, the pay gap, but Kathy Newman, he essentially said to her that part of the reason that women sometimes don't get paid as much as men on average, one of the many variables, is that they tend to be rated more highly for agreeableness, which is quite an archaic term, but it basically means, I'm sure you can all kind of guess what it means, but it means women tend to rate themselves as higher on a scale in terms of cooperating with others, being more people-pleasing, whereas disagreeability predicts more getting higher pay, because it means you're not as worried about saying, excuse me, I'd actually like 120,000 a year or whatever you want. And men tend to rate more highly. And this is supported by the biggest evidence for gender differences between men and women actually comes from the profile of psychological disorders. And it really doesn't look that good for men in a way, because they're more likely to be psychopaths. There are other things like men 4 times more likely to be psychopaths, autistic, have Tourette's, ADHD, whereas women are more prone to emotional disorders. So that's the biggest evidence, in my opinion, for gender differences that's backed up, that Jordan Peterson has talked about. He also talks about the fact that another reason for pay disparities is that men and women go into different industries. So there's something called the gender equality paradox, which is essentially a lot of people at the moment think that if you totally equalise society and you make everything even, you should see men and women want to do exactly the same thing. And Jordan Peterson talks about the difference between equality of outcome and equality of opportunities. So if you give people the same opportunities, what often happens, the more freedom they have, the more they diverge in what they actually want to do. So in Finland, for instance, they found that, which has one of the most gender equal societies, women and men, the divergences between their careers became more pronounced, with less women going into STEM subjects. And in places like Iran, with less gender equality, you get more women going into STEM because it's seen as a route to financial emancipation. So you could even say, if you really took that hypothesis further, that the fact that more women did better in A-level STEM subjects, even though it was really like lauded by the media, it might be a sign that the economy is not doing so well. If you I guess it sounds quite a miserable hypothesis, but maybe women are seeing it more as a route to financial emancipation. In terms of the lobster, I find that really interesting as well. I guess my take's like, your take was quite philosophical on it, I think, but I just, I kind of just saw it as Jordan Peterson was saying, that you can talk about social hierarchies all you want, but there are parallels in the animal kingdom. I think he's a bit of an evolutionary psychologist, and these are, this shows you that these are isolated from sociological influences. So the lobster, its serotonin system will respond to moving up within a hierarchy, and that pattern, is replicated. But I think a lot of left-wing commentators really didn't understand it, and they were just like, "Excuse me, I'm not a lobster," and like really offended. The only thing I slightly disagree with Jordan Peterson on, where it's not really my business, to be honest, because I'm not a psychologist, but I do think that he has a massive, on the internet, a lot of people listen to him, and he talks a lot about antidepressants. I've got nothing against them, but I do think we're seeing a lot of research at the moment that suggests the side effects are quite bad across a lot of the population, and we're kind of going down the American route, and so it does worry me that people kind of use him as a psychologist, and I think we need more evidence around this area. But I think his main contribution to society is bringing back biological arguments around psychology, and some of the reaction to him has shocked me quite a lot, because the fact is, like, our societal debate is quite behind what's actually happening, and people are very focused on Jordan Peterson as a psychologist, but psychology isn't even the real area where the genie is out of the bottle in terms of biology. It's actually more genetic research at the moment. So geneticists are able to uncover DNA patterns. So they analyse thousands of different DNA strands, and they can now tell people's risks for schizophrenia, alcoholism, things like that, and that's happening whether people like it or not. And I fear that the left are so focused on Peterson, they've almost like not. And I am generalising a bit, but they've got a blind spot up to this thing that's happening, and this is going to completely change our society in years to come. There's going to be something called, I don't know if people have heard of it, but precision medicine. So the more we have these DNA tests, the more people will be able to find out their genetic risk, and then you'll get medicine that is tailored towards it. So like one quite popular example is like addiction. Addicts can now be given something called naltrexone, which is an opiate blocker. So if you knew that you had, because some of I'm rambling a bit, but some of addiction is caused when your opiate systems are very highly receptive to certain substances. So if they can turn off that with a pill, then that can change, that can like put a stop in the cycle. So it's that sort of medicine. Even it's not just psychology, it's going to be for cancer treatments, like tumours can have targeted medicine. So without veering too much away from psychology, I think people can hate Jordan Peterson all they like, but he's just one voice in a new wave of psychology and research that's going to completely transform society, and needs much more debate because it could go either way, you don't know. But yeah, so that's my thoughts.
Very good. comments, questions? Let's start with the gentleman over there.
I'd like to start by actually applauding the panelists for the words that they've given us. I think that's really, really useful. From my point of view, I think this is perhaps the most important panel of today, because in some ways the previous subjects, while very important, and I have a great deal of time for all of them, this is the panel that is dealing with the real world. The psychology is also a reflection of the medical world that we live in, and over the last 5 years I've become aware and really appalled at the deep, entrenched, anti-scientific attitudes that's actually coming from, I'm ashamed to say, from the left, sort of that's the parties that I normally put my tick in. And 10 years ago, it was the born-again Christians over in America, the intelligent design, and I went along to some atheist groups and was quite involved in that. And then the tide seemed to recede, and we thought that perhaps that battle had been won. And unfortunately, it wasn't the war; it was just the battle. So what I would like to do is turn this into, having said that, turn this into a question, because I'm sure you don't want a whole speech. Where do you see the new fault lines occurring with the left's attitudes towards science? Where do you think we have a danger of it going wrong next?
You mean wrong in terms of the political intervention?
Yeah, as in the left seem to put more stock in narrative than physical reality, and I think it's useful to be able to boil these things down into one sentence. And I think I've got some way up. I have a diary that I write, and I explaining it as narrative over science, or narrative over reality, is the simplest way that I have to describe it to people. But where do you think or see the left attacking science next?
Can I just follow up on that one? So, encompassing everything that we've discussed today about Peterson and identity, and if science has become relativist, does he offer any solutions to that with what he's peddling, or is it, do we need to look deeper and go back to reason to understand science?
Thanks. Following on from that, though, I read somewhere recently that there's a disagreement between different sort of psychologists about the genetic or biological roots of behavioral differences. That cognitive psychologists are quite happy with the idea that there's a genetic component to IQ variation, but the social psychologists are not. I just wondered, particularly from Charlotte or anybody else who knows, whether that's actually correct. And also, to echo the last point, I mean, I've had this impression for a long time there is science denialism on the left, but I have to admit I've been reading sources which tell me that, and I haven't perhaps been looking for sources that tell me the opposite. So Quillette magazine has been, for example, recently been running quite a lot of articles about this sort of thing, of a very pro-Jordan Peterson kind, and Claire Lehman, the editor-in-chief, ran a very long YouTube interview with Jordan Peterson talking about this sort of thing. So what are the best, I mean, is there any serious intellectually respectable and well-grounded refutation of the claim that there's a lot of science denialism on the left, either refuting the idea that the left indulged in science denialism or refuting the idea that it's denialism rather than it's just speaking the truth?
Thank you. Let's go back to the speakers. You can jump on whatever question you want.
Okay. In terms of which, you were talking about genetic versus social psychologism, what's the most prevalent? Yeah, they're all quite, I mean, from my experience studying at university, like some of them seemed a lot more robust than others. Social psychology I would definitely describe as one of the most muddly, and I did the implicit bias association test when I did that, so I would still describe it as the most pseudoscientific, whereas genetic research is really concrete, and they've done a lot of meta-analyses on it and things like that, so it holds up quite well. So I would definitely say trust the geneticists more. But I don't think anyone will say, but also it depends what you're talking about in terms of phenomenon for predicting how much of it is caused by the environment and social. For instance, like weight is 70% heritable, whereas breast cancer is 10%. I read this in a book. I don't know if you know Robert Ploman, his book recently. So like there'll be different personality traits that have different levels of environmental causes. But I think the problem with the left is that they're just like, I do talk to people that just say, oh, it's just the environment, like the way you are is just the environment. And it's like, what? That's crazy. You know, you see these television shows about families that reunite and their mannerisms are the same and they've got personality traits. And there are studies showing that the big five, the famous personality traits, like even twins that are separated, they still have massive overlaps. So it's mostly a bit of both. It's the interaction that's more hard to pinpoint and which one outweighs more than others. In terms of the left and the fault lines, I think the problem is that they're really not prepared for some really complex debates we need to have. Like, at the moment, Matt Hancock, for instance, has given the green light for the NHS to roll out DNA testing for cancer and Alzheimer's. And who knows when that's going to end, because he might say, let's also do DNA tests for depression. Let's do DNA tests for addiction, and then we won't have to pay the bill, you know. And it could go further and further. But the left is so far behind from what I've seen in the debate. Like, they can't even grasp the fact that there are biological parts of personalities. So how the hell are they going to be prepared for that? And I do think, I'm not sure who exactly is to blame for the MMR vaccine. You know, the fact that children at school, talking in terms of anti-science, like the fact that so many of them aren't having that vaccine at the moment. But I do think the fact that science has been made into politics has contributed to that problem. It's kind of lost this ground as being, you know, the Gwyneth Paltrows of this world, and everyone has made it into a political battleground, and no one really has any proper say anymore over parents.
Okay, I just want to go with all those questions there, actually, and go with some of what you said. So, in terms of the fault lines, I still think it's determinism versus volition, just in new forms. I think that the left has always been very deterministic and doesn't have much space at all for what we might call free will, or the ability to focus one's mind. And that ties in very much with behavioural factors. Now, the debate, which I think is a false debate, it's a bit like, are you left-wing or right-wing? It doesn't take into account that maybe you're an individualist versus a collectivist. When we're talking about behavioural traits, and Gina Gorlin, who's coming here on the 4th of October, has got a lot of research. If you really want to get into some of the research around this, they're saying that 40 to 60% of behavioural traits are unexplained either by one's genetics or one's environment. Now, I'd argue that 40 to 60% is where the mind comes in, the ability to make choices and to focus the mind. So, in answer to that, I would say it's not just genetics, and it's not just one's environment, and it's not a combination of the two. There is another factor in there. And to answer, do we need to go back to reason? I would just say yes, absolutely.
I think I would add to that by saying the biggest problem with modern left-wing politics when it comes to science is playing we have the epistemic high ground game. What that game amounts to is saying, you should associate us with careful scholarship, which is why we're so dominant in the social sciences and the humanities, and associate anybody who disagrees with us with cranks and religious fundamentalists and evil capitalists like the Koch brothers. So that's the kind of meta-narrative that you see in most Guardian articles about things like climate change. And I should stress here that I'm not a climate change skeptic. I actually agree with the consensus that we need to become less dependent on fossil fuels and use the economy and business to create green energy type technology to replace it. So I'm definitely in the mainstream. But what I think the left has done about environmentalism, or with environmentalism, which is absolutely atrocious for science, is completely stigmatize minority opinion. So insofar as anybody is a skeptic, not just about climate change, but even subcomponents of left-wing environmentalist stances, you know, like the idea that we need to get rid of fossil fuels by 2025 and that's it, for instance. Anybody who's a skeptic about that gets completely stigmatized within science because it's so driven by leftist ideology in many respects. And if you stigmatize minority opinion, you're actually destabilizing science, because all scientific revolutions depend on the minority opinion dialoguing with the majority and the minority opinion changing the majority's mind. That's why we have everything from Newtonian physics in our past to quantum physics to the latest episodes of string theory in the past few decades. That all comes about because of interaction with the minority and the majority of scientific opinion. And what the left is doing is it's stigmatizing minority opinion because it's so afraid that if the public starts to agree with scientific minorities, the world will end literally. So in a sense, I can understand why the left would have that kind of paranoia, but the problem is, in order to solve the problem of climate change, you need decent science. In order to have decent science, you need to allow for scientific minorities to dialogue with the majority, and you need to allow for the public to take the minorities seriously, because the minorities often become the majority as time goes on.
Any other comments, contributions, questions? Gentleman at the back.
Have any of you come across any problems employment-wise with either, especially writing for newspapers, etc., or any issues from other journalists when you are talking about Jordan Peterson or what he discusses? I mean, are you shunned, or is there a positive side? Do you ever get told, no, you can't write about that? Things like that.
Any other points or questions? Right, so we can go to your thoughts and also answer whatever else you want on the table. Who wants to start?
In terms of newspapers, I don't generally like. It's just a lot of left-wing papers have just come for him. You know, they call him an alt-right hero and far-right and things like that. I did notice one time, every time, and this is no offence to like creative subjects at universities, but I noticed that every time I saw someone criticise his science, I went through a point of like Googling their degree, and it would be like art or like English. And I did do a post about that, and I got seriously trolled for it. And they were like, "How dare you?" And I had to go and like hide in a park and switch off my. I'm not even joking. I had to turn off my Twitter notifications and go to a park for a bit. But they were all creative science degrees. Yeah, in terms of Jordan Peterson, I definitely don't think he's like the Messiah. I mean, I think the point is that he conflates a lot of his science with kind of boring anecdotes about Jesus and things like that. And I did think 12 Rules for Life was incredibly boring, I have to say. And also, I think when he's best is when he's really pinpointed, when someone's like got him in a spot and then he gets them back. And I think that's why the Kathy Newman interview was really good. And so I think all these little gems that he has about science and psychology are really riveting. But I think, I just think he's just so important for a lot of people that want the biological argument brought back into the psychological debate. Like that was completely eroded and denigrated, and I think that's his main role when the left has been quite vicious about socialisation, and it's something we really need as we go forward, because the genie is out of the bottle. That's, this is the direction we're heading in terms of our research.
Thank you. Let's go reverse order. So, forget the order. Whoever. I forgot.
Just to answer your question, I've never had come across any antagonism around Jordan Peterson in my practice or in my work or amongst colleagues. He's quite a well-respected psychologist. He doesn't come up much, to tell you the truth. Much more in the culture wars, but not really. From time to time there's a reference, etc. And so I just reiterate that Jordan Peterson, I think, has given a lot of people a lot of insight into, as I said, acute interventions, and I think he's been very effective in many areas of that, and I'm appreciative of that. But I think he's a very mixed bag, and if you can take what you like and leave the rest, I would do that. Thanks.
Answering the question about what reactions I get when I say that I like Jordan Peterson, given the other things I believe, is normally with nice people incredulity. Like, how could you like such a huge asshole that's ruining the world? That's kind of one reaction from nicer people. And from not nice people, it's, oh, you're in alignment with him, you're part of the alt-right, you're a racist, you're a misogynist. And sometimes when I debate leftists online, when I make the mistake of doing that and I argue against something like white privilege, they'll say, I bet your only source that you're citing is Jordan Peterson. So that's the kind of reactions I get when I talk about why I like Jordan Peterson, despite my problems with Jordan Peterson. But I really feel like there has been a set of ideas that we've inherited in Western culture, really from the post-1960s world, which have been very useful. They are things that we should protect in many ways. I think the compassion towards minorities is good. The society becoming less collectivist despite being capitalist has been a very good contribution of 60s counterculture to the last few decades. But I think what's happened in the last 5 years is all of that has morphed into an extremist movement, which is illiberal and malevolent and dangerous for the world, dangerous for Western culture, and dangerous for stability and peace. And what we need now is probably somebody more conservative than myself to inspire and articulate things for people when they feel bullied and disempowered, because I think at the moment they are.
Thank you. So shall we give a round of applause to the panel? Right. Does Rosie want to do some goodbye remarks? Okay, whatever you say, can we give a round of applause also to the audience, to the speaker, to the funders, but also to Razi, because he's the guy behind all this.